Hey y'all, welcome to the T-Work podcast, hosted by Grant Banko and me, Adam Moreau. From entrepreneurs and athletes to the rat racers of corporate America and those who refuse to be put in a box, we want to share their stories and understand how they ended up where they are. Success and development come in many shapes and sizes. We want to hear about it all. So grab a drink and pull up a seat. Let's spill some tea and get to What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the T-Work podcast. Joining Banko and I today is a buddy of mine, Ben Parten. Ben and I got to know each other through the local Savannah Gaelic Athletic Association. Yes, the super niche sport or sports, I guess, that we play because we're weirdos like that and just need to feed the competition bug. But through one of our tournaments early on, I got to talking to Ben, found out that he is a professor at Georgia Southern. And beyond that, he is a published author and a historian. So he really has an awesome line of work that he's in. He's passionate about Civil War, the emancipation of slaves, and I know that's what we're going to talk a lot about today, really his journey through the civil rights movement and even before that. So specifically American history. Ben's a Georgia native, went to UGA, went on to Yale, and as I said, he's a professor now. So before I say anything too dumb, Ben, I'm going to kick it over to you, let you pick up the pieces on some of the intro stuff that I might have missed.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me, Adam and Banko. It's a real privilege to be here, and so I'm excited to see what we get into in our conversation. But yeah, as you said, Adam, I teach history at Georgia Southern, so that's one of the hats I wear as a historian. I teach comprehensive survey courses. We go at Georgia Southern from basically Columbus all the way to Ronald Reagan, or at least that's as far as I usually get in my U.S. Survey class. I've also taught a range of different graduate level courses, undergraduate courses, here at Southern, and then hope to teach an increasingly large range of classes as time goes on. And so that's one hat that I wear as a teacher, but also as a historian. I also do a lot of writing and research. And My general interest is American history writ large, and I've done reading fields, teaching fields, and I've written about a host of different U.S. history topics. But really, the 19th century and the Civil War, being from Georgia, is what's most familiar to me. That is typically what I've done the most writing on. And I do have a book coming out. It's called Somewhere Toward Freedom: The History, or Sherman's March and History of America's Largest Emancipation. And it's a story about Georgia in the Civil War, Sherman's march through Georgia, which is Georgia's most important moment in its history, I would argue. And what the book does is it reinterprets this moment less as a military campaign and more as a freedom movement. It looks at this moment from the perspective of enslaved people who are, experiencing it themselves. And so it acts as a real reimagining of this kind of long-held, or at least long-remembered moment in American history. That's coming out with Simon and Schuster in January, which is really exciting. But as I said, I really write about the 19th century U.S. history more broadly. I've been doing stuff on the California Gold Rush, westward expansion. Been doing work on biography as well. And so, yeah, so I love narrative nonfiction, love U.S. history. That's kind of what my passion is.
So can we steal
Before,
the honor and call this the first stop of the book tour?
I was going to say, I almost mentioned that. I've got a book tour in the works for the end of January. I've got a lot of press and media coming up. Doing an interview with NPR in January. Doing one Sirius XM radio. I think that's in the works. But you guys are the first, so this is
Heck
the
yeah.
inaugural Whistle Stop Tour. So great.
appreciate you making us the first.
Yeah.
Where can people buy the book once it comes out?
It's on Amazon. It's also on Simon Schuster's main page, and it's really going to be at Barnes& Noble and most anywhere you can find books.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
well,
before we dive in, can we step back and how you guys met? What association and what does that mean? Because I feel like a lot of people, including myself, have no idea what word you just said and what it is.
Well, I'll let you explain that one, Adam.
fine. Yeah, Ben's been in it a little bit longer than I excuse me, than I have. But Banko, as you know, I play a sport called hurling. The official distinction of hurling, or the overarching body, is the Gaelic Athletic Association, which pretty much means the governing body of Irish sports. And that would include the two oldest or most prevalent sports in Ireland. Forget about soccer and rugby right now. And under this body falls Gaelic football and hurling. Gaelic football is, I guess, a mixture of like Australian rules football, rugby, soccer, kind of all together, played with an oversized, heavy volleyball
Mhm.
effectively. And then hurling, which I think Ben and I like a little bit more than Gaelic football. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about that publicly, although it probably is evident based on our team
Yeah.
literally only competing in hurling tournaments and not football tournaments. Hurling is pretty much a mixture, at least I say it's a mixture of field hockey and lacrosse. It's marketed as the fastest sport on grass, and I believe it is recognized as the national sport of Ireland.
Well done, Adam. That is that is like I don't know if you get that in a brochure. That's like a perfect breakdown of I feel like GAA.
It's also a drinking club, which I do not participate in that aspect, but I'm all in for the socials.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that's how Adam and I got to know each other, and I don't know if Adam will say a little bit about why he's joined the club, but I'm I grew up playing high school baseball, high school football, grew up playing a lot of sports, and played co-ed softball for a long time when I was in graduate school, and really enjoyed it. Played co-ed volleyball too. When I got to Savannah, I wanted to find a similar kind of outlet, but I actually couldn't get on a co-ed softball team because they were not doing free agents at the time, and I saw the GA folks playing hurling in the park, and I said, "What in the heck is this? This is the craziest looking sport I've ever seen." But it was fundamentally a sport with like a stick, a hurl, and a ball, a slitter. And I was like, how hard could it be? It turns out it's incredibly hard. It's like, it's a completely different grip than the baseball grip, which I kind of disregard anyway. A lot of the kind of movements is very different. It's physical, it's active, and it's taken a while to kind of get used to, but it's a ton of fun and a lot of great folks. We have a lot of fun on the weekends and usually every Thursdays, and have had some success too. I mean, we've won a tournament, we've gone undefeated in a tournament, and yeah, it's a ton of fun.
Yeah, it's a blast. I'd say I got into it for a similar reason as Ben, just was chasing the same competition bug. I know I said that earlier in the intro, but since I wasn't doing on-field coaching anymore with baseball, I just needed some sort of outlet to compete other than golf, where I just want to beat myself up literally every time I go out there and it's expensive, or just lifting in a weight room where I'm solo for that as well. I needed to have a team, touch grass, watch a ball fly. And for me, I tried to play pickup soccer, but the pickup soccer here, for whatever reason, or the league, quote unquote, that I found, they wanted to know my past playing experience. They wanted to know the positions that I played or preferences. And instantly I was just like, this isn't for me. I'm not doing this. This is terrible. The 1 year of soccer experience that I have, if I can even call it that, I'm not willing to put that on paper for somebody to put me in a box and tell me I can only play one position for
Yeah.
adult rec pickup soccer. So ultimately, I found the hurling club on something online. I showed up, and turns out it's a bunch of other mid 20s to mid 30s individuals chasing pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, it's fun, and I'll say too, Adam, one of the things I've really enjoyed about it is it's been really interesting learning something new as an adult, like playing a sport that I never played before. It's very humbling, but it's also a real learning experience. You get to sort of sink your teeth into something else and be challenged and fail a lot. But it's fun to kind of push yourself and also learn a lot about sport and the culture that comes with it too. So it's been a really really fun experience. And you call it the fastest sport on grass, but I would just say not always how we play.
I'd agree with that, but yeah,
Yeah.
you're right about the cultural aspects. Like we've gotten to do some pretty cool things. I know we're kind of getting off on a tangent here, but we got to walk in Savannah's St. Patrick's Day parade. I think the club has done that for a couple years now, and that's a big honor down here. The St. Patrick's Day of Savannah is a massive deal. The whole city shuts down. The month of March is literally just a celebration. I wouldn't say it's quite on par with Mardi Gras in New Orleans, but it's a similar feel. Like that is the whole area's focus for late February through mid March. It's cool to be a part of, and then just get exposed to people in the area that either have come to Savannah from Ireland or direct descendants of those from Ireland. And it's really prevalent in our club. It's cool to learn. It's not something I ever knew about before joining the club, I guess a year and a half ago at this point.
No, not at all. I'm in the same boat. And quick shout out to, our leadership, Caleb and Dara and other folks. I mean, it's a formal, legit, organization, and all the kind of social aspects and stuff we do is really fun. And then the GAA as well, as a national governing body, it's very it can be as formal as you want it to be, but it's like a legit, organization that I think does a lot of good and is a really important space in kind of the adult recreation, world too here in Savannah. So it's cool to be a part of.
Yeah. Well, Banko, there you go. Don't know if you signed up for that when we got Ben on the podcast today.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even think Ben thought, like you asked before, where we're going to go with this conversation. Do you think you were going to give a 10-minute intro to hurling in the hurling club?
That was all part of the plan, right? It's all
Yeah.
recruitment, advertising,
Yes.
all part of the plan.
That covers Ben's and I's club dues for the next year, I'm pretty sure.
Exactly.
So I guess bringing it back to you, Ben, and sort of how you got into writing and all that. I guess going back to early childhood and growing up, when did you first realize? Because I feel like most people are either good slash enjoy writing or the exact opposite. So when
Yeah.
did that first come into your life?
Uh, well, I mean, one answer is I've always been like a bit of a bookworm. I just have always enjoyed reading different things. That's going back to the AR days as like a kid, but even in high school too. I always just really enjoyed it and made a habit for myself of always carving out time to read either before bed or whatever. And always enjoyed reading history and nonfiction, but also just various works of fiction as a kid. But then where things really changed for me, I think, was when I was at UGA in college, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to major in, what I wanted to do. But I remember taking a series of like composition courses, and like not journalism courses per se, but they were like writing for the web, modern writing, things like that. And part of these classes, it was like learning the fundamentals of prose, composition, writing, but it's also being exposed to a variety of different ways that writing is done, whether it's op-ed writing, whether it's newspaper writing, whether it's, long form, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that was just like really exciting. And I kind of knew after that moment that I wanted to be in the kind of world of what we would now call content creation, I suppose. But back then it was, kind of the world of writing, editing, and that sort of thing. Um, and then, I was always really interested in history. And so graduate school was kind of an interest of mine, something I wanted to do. I was told that it's a great opportunity to kind of go and learn how to write and actually, do the work of doing it. And I was fortunate enough to get a graduate fellowship at Clemson. And then I was fortunate enough to get another one at Yale. And so it was kind of a merging of doing, writing and then also history and then seeing them kind of come together is kind of how I got to sort of how I got to do writing sort of more professionally and more seriously and as a occupation, I suppose.
Sorry for not giving you the Clemson shout out early on. I
No,
guess
it's
that
all
one
good.
slipped my mind.
It's all, it's all good.
But when you were a kid, Ben, so you dabbled in a lot of different genres. I think every kid does. Were there particular books or authors that really drew you in? Like I remember the first series I ever got hooked on was the Magic Treehouse series.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, when I was a kid, it was the Hardy Boys. Like that was like the book that I like devoured, consistently devoured when I was, fourth grade. And then it was a little bit of everything, except weirdly Harry Potter. That was one of the books that I never really like got into. I read a lot of the Lemony Snicket books as a kid. But yeah, and so when I was a kid, I just really enjoyed it. And I really liked the AR aspect of it, trying to like read, get more points, more points. That was such a fun sort of thing to do as a kid. And yeah, and so that's kind of where it started is, the Hardy Boys when I was a kid, and then like the Lemony Snicket stuff, and then just really kind of anything I could get my hands on, I suppose.
I don't know if the AR points are still a thing, but just so everyone knows what you're talking about, it was at least for me in elementary school, like it was a motivation to kids to read books. So you would read a book, go into the library, go on the computer, take a 10 question test, and you get points, and then you could use those points to get prizes. At least that was how it worked at my elementary school. Um, but yeah, just giving background there. Um,
Yeah, that's how it
that
worked with mine too. And we also
okay.
coupled it with like physical fitness stuff. So like how many laps you run at PE. And so if you got so many AR points, you ran so many laps, that went into kind of the joint like prize pool. And by the end
No
of
way.
at the end of the year, you got these like prizes at like field day. They had a big like elementary school like sleepover. And if you like met these like metrics, you could like go to this like sleepover. But I also think that if you did so well in AR, you didn't have to meet as many like laps, which for me, as a big, like as like a chunky kid, that was my out. That was my avenue to not to run a mile every day, at PE in fifth grade and getting to go play basketball sooner. So that was part of the motivational aspect. It didn't help that my PE teacher was my aunt, so there was that too. But yeah, so AR was a lot of fun back in the day.
I wish mine would have had the physical part. I think we only had the book part. I definitely found a workaround and would use Spark Notes or something on some books, and
Okay.
we're able to take some of the tests and get points that way without reading the books. Um, but I guess staying on the school part of it, obviously you read books that weren't assigned to you, and I feel like a lot of kids think they hate reading because of just the assigned books that they get throughout their school um, tenure. Did you enjoy the signed readings as much as the books that you chose to read on your own, or like do you think it was more what you found it early that you enjoy certain types of books and the school books weren't really what you found interesting?
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't remember being all that taken by a lot of the books we read in school. I mean, we always did summer reading in high school and then had to read kind of the classics and stuff. And that was never as interesting to me. But, I guess to go, back to everything, and this has a tie-in, I think, to some of the work that y'all do is when I was playing football when I was 16, I tore my ACL. And I remember I had basically a lot of ideas of wanting to go on to play football and was always very active, was always in the gym. And then to suddenly like have that kind of stopped for 6 months, 9 months to basically just be sitting, on my bed, like in the couch, my leg like in a brace, doing nothing but physical therapy. That's when I really kind of started reading things on my own. I had all this time and started doing a lot of like just reading on things that I've found interesting and could kind of just pass the time. And I think that's really kind of where things started to, for me at least, in a way that was different than when I was younger. I started reading like kind of more serious books, trying to kind of read things that was going on in the world around me. And I don't want to say that was like a moment for me where I kind of grew up, but it was definitely a moment of um, shifting perspectives, that sort of thing. I mean, I think I was 16 at the time.
It's cool to for me to hear you say that because of the work I do in the elbow world and
Mhm.
another podcast I host in that realm. We talk a ton about identity and the personal journey and the mental side of rehab
Yeah.
and how much those things can impact you and change your perspective or make you feel differently about who you are. And typically, those who can bounce back well are those who discover quickly that there is something else out there. And it's not to say that you can't continue to be passionate about the sport you play when you got hurt. It's just that you are more than the sport you play.
Yeah.
And I think to me, it sounds like you learned at that time, that pivotal moment, like, oh, shoot, there is something else out here that I am extremely passionate about that I can dive into and explore.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fair. And again, I was 16, was laid up in bed, on the couch after school every day rather than going to practice. Now I had all this time on my hands. There was a period where my brother and I would race home to see who could play Xbox fastest. But that only gets you so far. And not only did that knock me out of playing football for that season, but it also knocked me out of baseball too. And I eventually stopped playing baseball. And so it went from being, just 6 months to then like having like basically a year, where what I had been filling my time with wasn't there anymore. So it was a matter of, keeping myself interested and sort of doing other things and reading and that sort of thing was really kind of where things turned for me.
Funny you mentioned Xbox, because I was gonna say it was very mature of you at 16 years old to decide to read books instead of just sit on the couch and play Call of Duty for hours on end, like I probably would have done if I was in your situation.
I don't want to, like I said, overstate things. There was a lot of that. My brother and I, we love to play the what NBA Street 2K was out. Was that the right name? It was like the sort of NBA street ball game that was out. We played
Yep.
that. We played Call of Duty, played Madden, NCAA football for hours. But there was also other stuff going on, and it wasn't just like after school too. Is playing like in the gym and PE for an hour, and rather than being able to take part with my classmates, I would just sit in the stands with my leg and a knee brace. And the only other thing I could do was play ping pong. I became a really good ping pong player because we had a table on the gym stage. But nonetheless, yeah, like I said, it was kind of a moment where you kind of learn other interests and kind of learn how to diversify the things that you're kind of interested in.
So now let's fast forward a little bit back to you getting into UGA. So
Yeah.
did you know right away, or did you declare that you were going into literature, history, writing, anything in that realm? Or was it just, I'm going to UGA and I'm going to go have the time of my life and figure it out while I'm
It's
there?
mostly the latter. I grew up a huge, huge UGA football fan. I mean, I grew up like 25 miles from the stadium. Been going to games since I was like 8. My whole family is huge dog fans and wanted to go to UGA. It's the only school I applied to. Mainly because I wanted to go watch as many football games as I could. Um, and then when I was there, one of the things about UGA is it's huge. It's like 40,000 students. There's people, from all over. And I really had no idea what I was interested in. It was just like one of 40,000, but I kind of found my niche in taking these classes in history and these sort of like composition courses, in part because it's what I was good at. It's where I excelled, and I don't want to say it was like a path of least resistance, but it was definitely one of those things where I was good at it, and I found that my experience there was kind of enriched in a way that I'm not sure it would have been, otherwise. I mean, I think as everyone else, now we've gotten older, probably have classes I wish I would have taken. In hindsight, I wish I would have done more like journalism stuff, foreign languages. I mean, there's all sorts of things now that I'm older that I wish I would have taken more classes in, or maybe even like double majored. I mean, I have one friend that he was a double major and a minor. I mean, college is such an interesting moment where you can like learn and dip your toes in so many things. But at the time, like I said, those were the classes that I was good at, so I felt good about myself when I was in them and was most interested in. But to answer
And
your question, I went in with like no agenda, like whatsoever.
And was that freshman year when you took those classes and figured it out, or was it farther on in your college career?
It's probably like freshman, sophomore year, I think. Freshman year is such a blur.
For a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah.
What did you ultimately declare your major in?
It was history. Yeah, I did history in a English minor with like a focus on composition and writing.
And when did you figure out, all right, I'm doing history, I want to pursue becoming a professor?
That's another question. I mean, I really didn't know, but I'd done some writing for a couple of like history sites and done some like writing projects that I was really excited about. And again, I was interested in writing, editing, and I was interested in history. So how I could merge the two was kind of where I found my kind of niche. And then I was kind of searching for ways to keep that going, and the possibility of graduate school came up. Um, and I said, well, I'll give it a shot, see what happens. It seems like an avenue where I can keep doing this kind of work, and then just like I said, see what happens. And the coolest thing happened, which is that I reached out to some folks who might serve as a mentor, advisor. And one of my mentors who I met while I was at Clemson, he happens to be from the same town that I was from. He's an incredibly close friend. He's blurbed my book now. He's become just really an incredible mentor and friend to me. He was there and he was like, yes, if you come here, I will be your advisor. I will help you. I was fortunate enough to get a fellowship there, so I could be a teaching assistant while I was there, while also taking classes. I got a stipend, and so it all just kind of worked out. And then it's when I was at Clemson doing an MA in history, working with my advisor. That's when it became a question, well, now what? And then it was a matter of going on. And I was fortunate enough to get another fellowship at Yale. And then it's kind of, oh, I don't want to say path dependency, but it's kind of how the path worked out.
And building on that, what's the process of getting those fellowships? Like, I have no idea.
Honestly, I think I got really lucky. But you apply for them, you put together like usually letters of recommendation, there's an application process, you put forward writing samples. And a lot of it hinges on finding folks who would be really good advisors for you. So that, making the connection with this one advisor, mentor, who then sort of helped me move on to Yale, where I found another just wonderful advisor and mentor. I think that was a really important thing. I mean, the kind of interpersonal or I guess personal relationships, I think really help, at least in, academia, and I'm sure in other, workplaces too. But so yeah, so it was a combination of, doing the application package, the writing samples, the recommendations, and finding a good fit for these places.
Sticking on the theme of the mentors or advisors, what do you think some of the bigger lessons were that you gathered from them? What did they just accelerate your process, or do you think these mentors truly opened doors or gave you opportunities that you might not have had without them?
I mean, not as a cop out, but I think it's like all of the above. And they certainly helped open doors. And I can think of ways in which like the opening of doors was very direct, as in they sort of helped reach out to folks, and sometimes it's indirect of just being able to know them and just being able to kind of put on to certain opportunities just by having certain proximity to them. But the biggest thing is just being able to like model the way that they do their work. I mean, to be able to watch the way that my advisor at Clemson went about his work as a historian, a successful historian, how he interacted with students, with folks at events, how he wrote, the kind of work he did. And then especially when I was at Yale too, my advisor there, the same thing, how he taught, how he handled himself, in giving, public lectures, how he wrote for the New York Times, right? And for all these other places, how he reviewed books, just being able to kind of model what it means to be a successful professional and also a really good person, you know? I mean, like a lot of professions, higher ed academia can be a very kind of sharp edged place in a lot of ways, and how to be, a good professional while also being like a nice and caring person at the same time, is how just those sort of daily lessons you learn from being around folks like that.
And I guess taking a step back, how did you initially build these connections with these mentors? Like, how did you get introduced to them or reach out to them?
The first time it was just kind of a cold email. Hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm interested in. Are you taking students? Would you be interested? And usually like faculty like myself would always be very kind of warm and welcoming, and to that. And then after that, it's just, develop a working, social and professional relationship, I guess. I mean, just getting to know folks on a personal and professional level. And then the cool thing too, I should say too about academia is that you get a chance in most cases to teach for the folks that you're working with. So I got to teach for my advisor. I got to teach for my PhD advisor at Yale. He let me teach a lecture. It's the first time ever lecturing, a lecture in front of 200 students in one of his classes. And so it's through that relationship that really I feel like I learned a lot. So the academia is a little bit different in that you got the teaching aspect. Then you also have to write projects, right? So I did an MA thesis when I was at Clemson, did a dissertation when I was at Yale, and they work with you through these sort of things. And so it's in that relationship where I think a lot of the relationship gets built.
I'm glad you brought up both your thesis and dissertation because I was about to just throw us into that realm and I was hoping for a good segue. So thank you for providing it.
Of
What
course.
did you do your work on for the thesis and dissertation, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, it's funny you say that, but it's basically the book. The book has been a 10-year, well, I won't say 10-year, but it's been a long process that began when I was at Clemson. It began with simply I needed a project. I needed a writing assignment. I needed to write a 100-page MA thesis. And at the time, I didn't really know really what I was interested in, but I knew I was from Georgia. I knew that I needed to have sources that were close by. And I knew that the easiest thing would be do what I'm most familiar with, which is just, Civil War Georgia history. And at the time, I was reading this really wonderful book called E.L. Doctorow's The March, which is about Sherman's march through Georgia. It's a fictionalized account. And in this story, as in all E.L. Doctorow books, if you haven't read Ragtime, his book Ragtime is one of the best, I think, historical fiction books ever written. But he always has this kind of kaleidoscope world of characters and people who are all a part of this one event. He shows kind of how history works in different perspectives to different people who are all part of it. But anyway, in this story, The March, Doctorow, he has a number of characters who are formerly enslaved people who are experiencing this march as a real freedom movement. And I thought to myself, I was like, wow, I've never heard this before. This is amazing. Surely this is a composite character, or these are composite characters that he's presenting, and that there is a real history here, and that hasn't yet been written, but that could certainly be written. And that's really the kind of opening door kind of challenge that I took to begin writing this thesis. And then when I got to Yale, it became a much larger dissertation project. And then fast forward after I finished at Yale, my advisor there was able to put me in touch with book agent who wound up with Simon Schuster. We put a proposal together, and now it's a book. So it's been a long process that really had kind of just basic beginnings of I needed a project. This is what I was reading. This is what I was interested in, and an idea kind of came together.
Quick step back, if you don't mind. Is it normal to see work stacked like that? I want to continue on this path that we're on with your book, your work, your energy and focus. But just from your, I guess, experience in the industry, do you normally see others, colleagues, take the same work or the same focus from a master's to a doctorate to eventual publication, or is it generally all over the place?
Uh, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I think folks can take different paths, and projects can evolve in different ways. I mean, I think the thing about an MA thesis or a smaller kind of project like that is that you're really kind of dipping your toes into something. And so long as there's a part two or further questions, right, or a larger story to be told, there's plenty of room to expand. And so that's really kind of how it worked out for me. But then too, I also think as historians, we have kind of areas of interest. Then you start digging into the sources, you start writing things, you start finding other things that interest you, and you start finding other opportunities to tell new stories from the stuff that you've done. Maybe it doesn't fit into what you're working in right now, but there's larger stories to be told. And just as an example of that, from this project, it's not a project about William Sherman, the famous Civil War general per se. But through doing this project, I found that his brother was a U.S. senator who was actually kind of the inventor of the U.S. dollar. He is the sort of sole one of the one of two people who is responsible for our modern system of banking. And they wrote 50 years worth of letters between themselves. And doing this first project, I discovered this source collection. And I thought, wow, this is a great story here, kind of waiting to be told. I proposed that as a second book project, and it got somewhat denied, but twisted now into a biography of William Sherman himself, of which his brother is going to be a key part of it, right? And so that's kind of an example of how once you dig into certain areas, you start learning things, you discover things, more questions come up, and then you start realizing that there are other book projects, stories, articles, kind of, I won't say waiting to be written, but that are out there once you kind of start looking and surveying, the material.
I could take us on a completely different tangent with finance and stuff, but I won't do that. How many, if you had to guess, start to finish, how many drafts did you write of the book?
That's a good question because and not to be kind of classically evasive as historians often are, but it kind of depends on how you define what a draft is. Um, I've had a complete version, about 120,000 words, um, for a while now. But you always kind of tinker with the ending of one chapter, you tinker with this or that, right? And so for me, the process isn't like write out a draft, redraft, redraft. It's always on the computer screen. It's changing this, it's changing that, it's going back, rereading again, changing this, changing that, changing this. And so the kind of drafting is always kind of a pulling on threads, pulling on strings, and seeing what happens. But um, with my publisher now, with Simon Schuster, we went back and forth 3 times. So we made 3 kind of pass-throughs. But then you get into the kind of copy editing stage and you get more pass-throughs. So it's really hard to kind of quantify just how many drafts it goes through, because one of the things I've learned in writing like this is that, writing is maybe like 30% actual text production, and it's 60% going back through and changing things and altering things, and that really the progress is made in that last 60% of editing.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted you to sort of go into that detail just to give people that have never written a book, including myself, how much work it actually is, instead of just like, oh, I wrote 100 pages, I'm done. Like, there's definitely a lot more than that to it.
Yeah, and one of the things I found in doing this is that like the real kind of leap that is made in, like, I think the quality of things really takes place in like the final 10%. Like the first like 90%, 80% is just putting ideas on a page. Text on a page is better than the no text on a page. It's kind of building something, and then going back through and really trying to put the final kind of polish on it, and things that I'm usually unhappy with or think is leaving a lot out. It's only in that kind of last stage where sometimes it kind of comes together and you finally get happy with it. And so, um, I know one of the things I work with my students on is that when we're in high school or whatever, you learn about the writing process, right? 1 draft, 2 drafts turn in. But when you are doing a book like this, the process is much more multifaceted and really kind of never ends in some respects.
I'd assume it is much more muddy than the cyclical fashion that we were all taught in
Yeah.
school. And as you outlined, yes, you wrote a draft, but how do you define redrafts? It's just what what you feel sounds good, what tells a better story, what calls out the main point, the purpose. And I'm sure what gets tough is any given day you feel like you think of something better, or you it's just like the weather. What you prefer is going to change constantly.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of folks I think get kind of daunted by this process, right? I mean, it is kind of scary, like doing something and then submitting it sometimes to, you know, an editor or whatever to for people to assess and offer feedback and comments on. And it can be a real kind of like psychological jolt sometimes when you work really hard on something, you send it out and you get all these edits and feedback back and changes to be made. And sometimes you just have to kind of swallow it, sleep on it, think about it. Um, but one of the ways that I like to think about it is that it's just the necessary process of moving something to completion, right? That you can't actually finish until you actually go through all these sort of steps, right? And so instead of just getting kind of bogged down in all that you need to do, it's just like I said, it's just all part of the process. And if you don't do it, you're not going to ever finish. And if you don't do it, you're not going to have the kind of quality that you want in the end. So it's just kind of accepting that this is just what it looks like. You know, when we read books, when we go to Barnes and Noble, we see the finished product. We don't see what's before, you know, what goes into it before. And it's kind of helpful sometimes just to recognize that it takes a minute sometimes to actually do it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you keep bringing up of there's a quality piece to these books and how much it matters of the editing process and going back and forth to get that quality and that time that it takes where again we see the finished product, oh, this is easy, they produced a book, it's good. It is definitely a process. During that process, I'm curious how often you can't fall asleep or you wake up in the middle of the night because something is on your mind about the book or an idea of and you needing to get it out of your head.
It's all the time actually. Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard. It's really hard because it's one of those things that you just kind of take it home with you. It's hard to leave it at one spot. You're always kind of thinking about it. And one of the things that I found too is that reading is often the best way to be a strong writer. You know, I mean, you work in the morning and then you, at least for me, oftentimes, and then you go about reading whatever it is, and you realize that some people are really good. You see how they're doing it, and then sometimes that can work as like kind of inspiration, but also kind of gives you ideas, right? It's almost kind of like words or these kind of like unnatural things that once you're exposed to them, they just start sort of like flowing more, you know. And so because of that, it's often hard to like kind of put things down, you know, you reading the newspaper or, you know, magazine or another book that you're interested in, and it kind of triggers something that kind of makes you want to go back to the computer screen. And so it can be really difficult to put things down. But you know, you got to sometimes.
Shifting slightly, this is something I've wanted to ask since getting you on for this interview. Really, I've been thinking about it for a while. You work in nonfiction.
Uh-huh.
I'm very curious how you are able to toe the line of your emotion or your personal beliefs in what you are writing about. I'd imagine that's difficult because you do have to tell a historical account of something that happened, but it would be grossly wrong to say that those things don't make you feel a certain way. And it has to be difficult as a writer and a historian to play that back and forth. I really can't even begin to fathom what you go through, so I don't want to try to lead you anywhere. I'd just love if you could comment on that and maybe the back and forth that you have internally.
Yeah, no, it's a huge question. And in some ways that's kind of the ball game, right? I mean, that's one of the big questions that we face every day when you sit down to write anything. It's kind of grappling with the kind of weight of the past and the need to be correct, but also to deal with, unsavory and sometimes very difficult topics. But I think, at least for me, it is difficult, and it's always kind of a push and pull kind of sort of thing of what's required, what can you include, what can you not include, how do you check your own kind of political biases, your own emotions at the door. And it's really kind of a hard thing to completely answer. But I think when you're actually doing it, so long as you're conscious of these thoughts, of these emotions, so long as you're conscious of some of these biases you might have, it's easier to kind of hold them in check. I mean, you're not going to do away with them completely. You're not going to be a complete like automaton, writing these things. But I think the more you can kind of weigh them judiciously as you're working on these things, there is a path to doing it, and I think doing it effectively. And we're not all going to be completely unbiased, subjective observers. It's not just a matter of just the facts. We have our own kind of perspective, emotion we always bring to these things. And sometimes it's difficult because the source material you have it themselves can be unstable, right? It can be somewhat unreliable. You only have so much material. But I think when you come to an issue like that, again, I think being very judicious, being very conscious of these questions and of these questions of objectivity or emotions, and then also knowing that your reader is likely to have them as well, and being kind of upfront with your reader too about where you're coming from, about the nature of this kind of business and of a topic, right, is kind of the only pathway I think to dealing with some of these things. I'm not sure if that's an answer, but it's kind of how
No,
I.
I think that's great. And then I'd say even a quick follow-up. I apologize, Banko, if I'm stealing anything from you, but quick follow-up on that would be, do you feel that your voice ever gets influenced by the research or by the accounts that you have to tell? Like, do you lose, are there situations where you feel you lose your power as a writer because of the source material that you have to work with?
um Yes and no. I mean, sometimes you definitely sort of a weird analogy, but sometimes like writing is kind of like driving a car. Like sometimes you want to like hit the gas and go really fast through things, and you really want to just kind of move and through like short, punchy sentences, kind of keep things moving. You want to keep like the language really like smooth and crisp. Then sometimes you get to something that requires like a much more sort of slower approach. And sometimes I can feel like you're hindering or you're like handcuffing your own ability to move through a story and to get something done. And you feel like the kind of topic is really kind of pulling against you a little bit. But at the same time, you have to kind of recognize that there's only one way to do it, and that is by going slow or by, using certain word choices and fully explaining these things, even if it cuts against like the pace of the story, the argument. You have to kind of realize that this is just kind of the necessary course of action you've got to take. And so in that sense, you do kind of feel like sometimes you have to alter your voice or your style to kind of meet certain topics. Um, so yes, but also no, sometimes in the sense that, as a writer, oftentimes we really are kind of only curating the story of the sources themselves, right? And so um, I think it's less a matter of like checking your own voice or altering your own voice so much as just letting the story kind of tell itself. And so kind of removing your voice as a way of highlighting the sources or highlighting the story. And, Cormac McCarthy kind of famously said once that when your material is good, just get out of the way. And so sometimes that's a kind of thing that I like to think about too, sometimes when you have interesting material, interesting sources, and are trying to tell a story. Sometimes they just let the story tell itself.
Along these same lines, do you think this thought process of your voice and the materials you're using, are you more conscious while you're drafting initially while you're writing and trying to purposely write that way, or do you think it more comes in, all right, now I'm going to go back and read this and sort of think about this from the reader's perspective? Which do you think comes more into play?
I think the latter. I mean, when you're first trying to get something down, it's often just seeing if you can kind of explain it to yourself, right? Or seeing if you can kind of make sense of it as the writer, right? You're trying to just kind of put something into a timeline, into a chronology, into a story. You're trying to find the words, the terms that make, whatever part of the article or piece that you're working on makes sense. And then sometimes, you have the kind of voice in the back of your head. You have the critical eye that you have as a reader and as a writer say, it's not quite measuring up to kind of what I wanted to say or what I want it to sound like. And it's in the redrafting process and the editing process that you can kind of find that voice or the speed or the pace of something. But oftentimes, I think we write to actually learn ourselves. And so it's a matter of writing it first, figuring out, yes, this is how I want to explain it. And now it's a matter of like making it match the kind of voice or the style, the sound that I want it to sound like.
Kind of a different question. I'm not sure if Adam wants to stay on this or not, but when you're writing, obviously the book is typed up, but how much do you actually take a pen or a pencil and handwrite first and then transpose it into text on a computer?
Yeah, so I'm actually a big um like scribbler. I've got a notebook that I keep. It's like an old moleskin that to me is like my life. Like I have notes in it. I have things to do, like, teaching stuff in it, right? It kind of works as both like a to-do list, and also just a professional like writing journal. And oftentimes it can fit in my back pocket, so it's easy to kind of carry it wherever I want to go. But usually it's important just to sit down and just kind of start sketching things out. And oftentimes it's less full-fledged like sentences or paragraphs so much as it is just certain ideas or outlines. And usually I will go from there to the screen. And like I said, sometimes it can be full sentences, it can be full paragraphs, sometimes like half a paragraph, sometimes it's just an outline. And usually for me, once I get a topic sentence, meaning the first sentence of a paragraph, um, I can kind of get moving like really quickly. And so a lot of times I'll just outline, what is the topic sentence? What is the topic sentence? What is the topic sentence? And that for me is kind of how I think through moving down a page and moving through a chapter. It's like, what notes do you want to hit? How are you going to transition from one source or one part to the next?
How often are you finding yourself really having to muster up the energy to get behind the laptop or like get to the keyboard? Because I know you aren't entirely writing from a complete creative space, but that's also grossly wrong to say that there isn't creativity involved what you're doing because you still have to tell a story.
Yeah.
Everything you said earlier about the voice, about trying to entertain and provide information to a reader, you still have to tap into that side of things. So, do you experience the writer's block? Like, how often are you like really forcing yourself versus like, no, it's all flowing. I'm good. I can just work today.
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, I consider myself somewhat fortunate because I don't know, I'm kind of a let her rip person. Like once I sit down, I usually can kind of get going and find like some sort of like crease or line or at least these are how I think about these things to kind of get moving and get going. But there are certainly times where the tyranny of the blank screen just like takes over and you start questioning, is this any good? Like, how am I going to do this for the next 6 months or a year or 2 years? How am I going to be able to do this? You begin questioning, am I just writing this only to delete it later? And that can be a really kind of debilitating space. And then sometimes too, it's a matter of like um, getting out over your skis a little bit. You don't feel completely comfortable in knowing where you're going next, and so you feel like you're just kind of digging around in a sandbox without actually having any direction. And that can be a kind of form of writer's block as well. And so you most certainly feel it. And then for me, my kind of goal is I can usually write about 1,000 words to 1,200 words a day on a good day. But once you get kind of past that, sometimes I feel like the kind of, I don't want to call it fatigue, but you begin to kind of get beyond what you were prepared to do for that day. Things start kind of falling apart a little bit. And that's usually when I kind of feel like it's a good place to like stop, think about what I've done, think about where I'm going next. And that usually is a way I think of stopping writer's block in some ways. Um, I know Ernest Hemingway said that he never went beyond what he had already prepared to do. And he would never leave until he knew what he was going to do the next day. And that's kind of how he kept himself writing. And that, I think for me, sometimes is a pretty good method of knowing what's coming next and trying to avoid writer's block.
And then on average, how long does it take you to write 1,000 to 1,200 words in a day?
I usually get started every morning at about like 8:15 or 8:30. And if I have no interruptions, and have uh, all the kind of materials and stuff that I need, I can usually get to about 1,000 words or 1,200 words by noon, about 1 p.m. Um, but sometimes it can be really variable. I also teach, there's student emails, there's classes, there's always stuff that's kind of going on. But the 1,000 words is usually like my benchmark of like, that's my goal. If I can do that in the morning, like that's like a successful day. Because then if you do 1,000 words a day, a chapter, let's say it's 10,000 words, right? You can sort of see how it begins to like add up like that. And it's a way of kind of keeping the process moving down the tracks. Um, but there are some days where that is much more of a optimistic, generous goal. And some days, in other words, some days it happens, some days it doesn't, just because things kind of get in the way sometimes.
Where do you do your best work, and how important do you think it is to set up that kind of environment?
That's another good question. I work just at my desk here. And in our house, we have a little office space. We've got just a small desk with a big screen that I sit in and do everything. Uh, and if you'd asked me this a couple years ago, I would have said it's really important to have a designed kind of space that is your happy place, that you can just kind of sit and block everything out. The older I've gotten, the more kind of more comfortable I've gotten working in different places, and so long as you have a computer screen and ability to do it, um, I found it easier to kind of get the muscles moving and to kind of sit down and to be able to do it. And so I do think I do my best work when I'm in my routine. And so I think that's part of it. It's less about the space so much as the routine. If you can kind of keep the same kind of schedule, that I think is more useful sometimes than having a specific place that, everything feels right. The vibes are good. It's more or less keeping the routine rather than the place sometimes.
And you mentioned the process of writing a book is 6 months, year and a half, 2 years. You've been working on your thesis over the last 10 years. I'm assuming you're a long-term, goal-oriented, long-term vision person. If I'm not, you can correct me. But where do you think that initially came from growing up? Because I feel like a lot of people look for feedback along the way, and that would be very difficult writing a book.
Yeah, I mean that's like that's another one of those, just like Adam's question a second. This is kind of like the ball game. I mean, this is one of the big questions of how do you actually do this? And um there are no real easy answers. And for me, like the year, 2 years, 6 months is one kind of timeline, but every project has a different timeline. It all depends on how much research you got to do, how easily available are the resources. So this one I did a lot of kind of archival material, so I needed really much more than 2 years to actually do the research necessary to do this book project. This other project I'm working on, a lot of it's available online. I've already kind of done a lot of it, so it can kind of move, a little bit faster. And so the timeline is always completely variable and up in the air. But you do need to be a kind of long-term planner for some of these things or else you'll never kind of get it done. And where it comes from, I don't really know. I mean, that's a really really good question about being able to think through these things. But the thing that I think I'm really good at is being fairly routine oriented and being kind of disciplined and being able to kind of do the same thing every day. And so for me, I think to be able to do some of this is just the kind of ritualistic, routine-oriented person of always starting at like at 8:30, always kind of doing this, always kind of looking for a quota. And then once you kind of get that routine down, then you can kind of start figuring out long-term plans and figuring out, well, I'm gonna try to finish this, this time, or maybe I'll have a chapter done by then. So once you kind of establish those routines, you can get a better sense of the long-term vision. So I don't know where that vision sort of came from, but I think one of the things that helps me do it is this insistence on routines. But your point about feedback is also a really good one, because that's the other kind of thing you always kind of grapple with when you're doing this work, is that oftentimes you're writing in isolation and you don't really have immediate feedback until you begin to send things out. So a lot of times it's just you and the page and you yourself trying to assess, is something good or is it bad? And then sometimes it can take really long to get feedback back, right? You send it out to an editor, it takes them weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months. Sometimes you never see it in print until years down the line. And so it can be a kind of constant battle with your own psyche sometimes, of trying to get some form of positive feedback. And this is why I like doing like op-eds and like magazine newspaper pieces, because they're working on a much faster deadline. And so sometimes they have more of an incentive to actually um, get you edits back, to put it in print, to pay you, and some of these things. And so I like doing different things in part because you get different feedback back at different times.
Yeah, still got to get paid at some point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
writing for passion is awesome, but you do have a couple of mouths to feed.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So sticking on the routines, this hopefully is my last question here. We'll see what happens, because I guess that's kind of the nature of why we started this podcast anyways, how people become successful in their unique fields. Is there certain check boxes that you need to feel minimally successful on a given day? You said you try to structure this routine. You talked about the 1,000 words, the 1,200 words, but with everything else you have going on, if you don't hit that, I can't imagine it feels great to say like, "Oh, today was a failure," but maybe you didn't hit your 1,000 words because you had to grade papers that day,
Yeah.
and you can have victories elsewhere. So I'd just love if you can map out how you identify success with such a long-term project.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, success is just kind of keeping the train on the track, like trying to hit those benchmarks just to keep things moving along. I mean, I think the way that projects like this can kind of die sometimes is just by not touching them, not working on them, and letting the writer's block or whatever just kind of keep you from working on it. And so, the 1,000 words is like a good benchmark for me, just to kind of know that I'm still kind of making progress towards like a long-term goal. And maybe it's 800, maybe it's 500, maybe it's only a paragraph. But so long as you're always kind of consistently making progress, because that is, as you mentioned, grading papers, that's kind of part of the nature of being a faculty member, is, and being a professor like this, is that we teach, but being in the classroom is really the most visible thing we do. Um, but actually being in the classroom is 1 hour, 2 hours a week, 3 hours a week. And there's other responsibilities, whether it's grading, whether it's serving on curriculum committees, whether it's advising students, being in office hours, prepping notes and stuff like that. There's other things that kind of can sometimes make this writing time smaller than I would like. And so it does get hard, I think, to balance my own writing work versus the teaching work that goes into it. And so I try to carve out 4 hours every morning to write, and then spend the rest of the time doing um, other teaching work. That doesn't always happen. In fact, many days it's mostly all teaching work. But for success for me is like just keeping the train on the tracks, making progress, and even if I don't work on it one day, allocating time the next day to make sure that I get it done. So it's just continuing to kind of put the pieces in order, and getting things closer to the ultimate goal.
And how, staying on the routine part as well, how has your mindset evolved over time? Because you mentioned, if you had asked me a couple years ago, I would have to be at this desk, that's where I work, that's what I do. It seems like you become a bit more relaxed about the routine in a sense. I guess how has that evolved over time? I mean, just speaking from my personal experience, like I've been obsessive at times of like I have to do this every day, no matter what. People get obsessed with morning routines. I guess just from your perspective, how has it evolved for you?
Yeah, I've definitely become more flexible, and in part teaching has made it made it so. I mean, when you're a graduate student, you're kind of in despite not being paid very much, despite having deadlines and a lot of responsibilities, it's a nice time because you usually have more time to actually just kind of focus on your own work. But now having a larger teaching load, having more requirements and doing all that sort of stuff, it's forced me to be a lot more flexible with my routine than otherwise, and it's forced me sometimes to recalibrate to Adam's question, what success looks like. Um, and so yeah, so you just learn how to adapt, how to be more flexible, and you also get good perspective to know that, well, yeah, maybe I didn't do it this day, but tomorrow, next day, you just get a little bit more. Um, I don't know, take a more kind of holistic kind of approach to it, and just recognize that some days, you're just not gonna be able to do it, and that's all right. But again, I think just being aware of that and having that perspective, I think, is puts you in a better frame of mind.
Banko, are you cool to shift over to Ben's actual work, his publications? I know we've drilled him a good bit. You cool with it? Routine
Yep.
check. We're done.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah, that was the last question I had on that.
Sweet. Okay. Yeah, because we've gone this far. We've drilled Ben about all or how he approaches work. We haven't spent too much time on the actual physical work and what he has accomplished, what he has done. So, Ben, I know you teased some of the op-ed stuff. You teased a little bit about the Washington Post, and then, of course, your book. So, I don't know which direction you want to go from here, but I'd love for you to brag about yourself for a little bit, actually talk about the work that you have out there that people can access.
Yeah. So, well, how to start? I mean, yeah. So that's really the kind of the two prongs of the kind of things I do is the big book projects, but also this kind of smaller magazine articles, op-eds, stuff you can find online. And that's stuff that I really enjoy. Actually, it's a lot of fun. Like I said, you get much faster feedback. You can kind of follow your own interest, and so one of the spaces where I kind of got an entry into this was long form book reviewing. So I wrote a series of or a handful of essays for the Los Angeles Review of Books, that take books, authors, contemporary events, and kind of contextualizes it. Wrote one on Cormac McCarthy and the scope of U.S. history, and how Cormac McCarthy, as a fiction writer, is mimicking a lot of the historical trends of the past like 20 years. And that was kind of a good piece for me because it was really interesting and really exciting. I got to write a lot about a lot of history. It also won a People's Choice Award by the magazine, meaning it was one of the most widely read articles for that year. I've written, like I said, a series of op-eds for the Washington Post, a lot of them about history, politics, how uh, uh, oftentimes it's the history behind the news, right? Like I wrote one most recently a few years ago about the uh, fight over the Speaker of the House. Was Kevin McCarthy going to remain Speaker, or was he not? Written essays about how the Democratic Party should reclaim the idea of freedom, and there's precedents for this in the past for how you can change rhetoric and all this sort of stuff, and those things I find to be really interesting. And then actually, most recently today, actually in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, an op-ed of mine is out in print, which is kind of cool. I found that out this morning. And that's kind of a smaller, abridged op-ed of the larger book project that's coming out in January. And so yeah, so there's these two prongs. It's doing these sort of smaller pieces and then doing the bigger book projects.
Out of curiosity, do you have a like this is my best piece that I've ever written or favorite piece that you've ever written?
Yeah, probably the Cormac McCarthy piece. And then one of the first ones I ever wrote was It was a essay about the writer Gore Vidal, who was a fiction writer, but also a kind of political essayist. And he wrote a fictional book about Abraham Lincoln, which is really funny, because basically Gore Vidal himself wanted to be a politician, and he wrote this character of Lincoln as basically himself. And so the article that I wrote was basically about how this book is Gore Vidal putting his best politician's face forward. And that was just a ton of fun to work on and to write. And both of those were from the LA review of books. So those are probably my two favorite, essays that I've ever written.
I think I might be combining the previous hour of conversation we had with now the current 5 minutes or so with this next question. Now I'm curious about how you deal with when you feel like you absolutely nail it, but maybe it doesn't do great in the public space, or on the other side, like the public absolutely loves something, and for you it almost felt like throwaway work. How do you deal with that?
It's funny you say that, because that's something I haven't really thought about much, but it's happened before where, some things that you really believe in, and there are a few things that I can think of and that I've had in the pipeline that I really believed in and wanted to kind of get published and wanted to push further, that just kind of got squashed, or it got like edited to be completely different from what I originally had in mind. And that can be a really tough thing to kind of get your mind around, because you don't want to appear too like egotistical, or like you don't want to be too brazen about things. Then sometimes you got to stick to your guns, and so it can be a really hard balance to strike. And I mean, usually the best practice is to defer to the editors, because that's what their job is. They're the ones that have a better pulse for things. They're the ones that are going to sign off on it being published anyway. And so it's usually better to defer to their judgment, and then again recognize that this is just part of the writing process. You gotta take the lumps, you gotta take the edits, you gotta take the do the process. And but it can be a kind of tough thing sometimes when you have something you really believe in. The phrase I like is you got to kill your darling sometimes, and just deal with it. But it can be a hard balance to strike sometimes. And there's
Have
definitely a few things that I've written that have been published. I look back and I'm like, "Ah, God, I really shouldn't have compromised on that." But it happens. It happens.
Have you ever released your version when you felt that it got changed too much in publication, or a publisher didn't actually even use the piece? Have you gone on like social media or something like that?
tailored
No, no,
version?
no, no, no. I've never done that. I think yeah, no, I've never done that. Uh, you know, um, Again, like I said, I think it's part of just recognizing that the editor, the publisher is a gatekeeper for a reason, and usually it's better, like I said, to defer to their judgment. And again, oftentimes it is, they're likely right. So.
Ben's just waiting 15 years to do that, much how Taylor Swift did it. Why do it now? You're sacrificing financial benefit. You should wait until there is a lull and you can generate a little bit of demand. Come on, Banko, you work in finance, you get this.
True, true.
Ben, if you're cool to do it, I'd love if you could highlight maybe a part of your book that you're particularly excited about, or something that you feel kind of sets it apart. I know this is something different than what's been published before, the way you've written it, but I'm sure there's either a chapter, an excerpt, or something that you feel a strong tie to.
Yeah.
And I guess it's hard for you to pick since the whole thing's your baby, but maybe just something that you think is exciting that you can throw out there for us.
Yeah, well, there's two chapters that really kind of make up what I think is the bulk of the book, and it's really different stories about how enslaved people take their own lives into their hands and run to the army. They escape plantations. They really seize their own freedom themselves, and the stories are kind of incredible. It's doing things like stealing horses. It's acting as intelligence scouts for the army. Um, one of the things that's kind of interesting that happens in Georgia is that the U.S. Army moves through Georgia, and they begin looking to forage material to try to find food, goods on plantations. But oftentimes, the plantation owners try to keep these things hidden so the army wouldn't find them. But the people they often forced to hide them were enslaved people themselves. And so this gave enslaved people real intimate knowledge about where these things are hidden. And oftentimes they use this to share with the soldiers or to lead soldiers out into certain spaces. And it gave them real power and leverage in this kind of really fraught historical moment. And the kind of stories of kind of war like this, a civil war on such an intimate scale is really kind of exciting, but also I think more than anything kind of inspiring. And that ultimately I think is what I try to do in this story, which is, yes, it's a story of the Civil War. Yes, it's a story of armies and enslaved people, but fundamentally it's a story of how um, large groups of people who have been lost to history, who are otherwise faceless in history, nameless, that existed on the margins of, America at the time, nonetheless, through their collective action, were able to really take a leading part in this important historical moment. And as I try to show in the book, go on to really be influential in what happens after the war and how the Civil War went on to kind of redefine what American freedom looked like. So it's really a story about how these average, like I said, faceless, nameless people in history uh, collectively went on to actually shape the order of history. And that is the kind of history and the kind of writing that always excites me. It's part of what drew me to this project to begin with. And that is, I think, what I ultimately hope readers will take away from it and also find exciting too.
You kind of answered my next question of what the readers wanted, what you hope the readers get out of this book. But I think a good perspective that you bring up, and we don't have to go down this rabbit hole, is just more thinking philosophically about history. And I mean, what you're saying about this book in particular is we all feel that what we do matters so much in the grand scheme of things, which it does on a grand scale. But if you think about it, 2, 3 generations from now, people aren't going to know who you are, who you were, what impact you directly had selfishly. So I think it's just a good perspective for people to have. It's like, yes, what you do matters, but not from the name, from a name sense of you're not going to be remembered by your name and you in particular.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the tragedy of history, which is that oftentimes, right? I mean, a lot of history is written about presidents and founding fathers and all this sort of in part because they're the ones who were literate, who left the most records, but there's huge swaths of people who, for history, have existed beyond these records, or who only appear in these records as names, right? Or don't really, like I said, appear. Um, but one of the kind of exciting things about history writing is that there are always ways of still telling these stories and of highlighting their contributions and of giving these otherwise, I think, forgotten folks their like real historical due. And I can think through my time at Yale, the other different books that do this kind of work so exceptionally, and I think make history so exciting and always a kind of ripe space to rewrite and tell new stories. And that is kind of ultimately what excites me as a writer and historian, which is finding new ways to tell these stories and also finding new ways to tell them in a way that highlights other voices, new voices, and also really, I think, kind of topples the way that we think about things, right? That really forces us to reimagine what this moment was, or reimagine the narratives that we like to tell ourselves. And again, one of the things that I try to do in this book is to do that, to recast this event, but also do so in a way that highlights folks who have been long forgotten and long erased from the historical record.
Giving voices to the voiceless is an unbelievable thing. So I applaud you for going down this path. I'm extremely excited to read the book, not just because you're my buddy. I think it'll be awesome. Like This topic is amazing. I thought of you when I was in Atlanta the other day. I didn't even put two and two together literally until we were setting up for the call today. The neighborhood that Corey and I were staying in for our Airbnb had multiple historical site signs citing William T. Sherman. So
Oh,
yeah, I guess I should have taken a picture for podcast socials or something while I was up
yeah.
there.
Yeah, Atlanta is like a living history museum as far as that goes. I mean, credit to the Georgia Historical Society. They've got their historical markers everywhere. And I was in Atlanta too, when I was in Tucker visiting my wife's grandmother where she lives, and all on one street there's just marker after marker after marker. And as someone who grew up in Georgia, someone who's interested in history, this was the kind of material, the topics that was closest at hand. If I grew up in Massachusetts, maybe it'd be different, or if grew up in Texas, maybe it'd be right about cowboys. I don't know. But it is important, and one of the things that I always teach my students is about how relevant this all is, and it seems like it's in the past, but in many ways it's living history. What Atlanta looks like, the landscape. To go back to William Sherman's brother, right? I mean, inventing the dollar bill, right? These are all things that we still have in our pocket, and it's still very, very relevant for us today. And then again, that's something also that really excites me.
Well, Ben, before we let you go, do you feel there's anything that we missed? I know there's thousands of other things that we can talk about, but I want to make sure you feel your voice is heard while we give you the opportunity before you become the voiceless.
No, no. I really just appreciate y'all having me on, and I feel like we've covered a lot, and I appreciate the kind of questions y'all ask too, because as I said, this can be kind of isolating work in a lot of ways. You're always kind of toiling away at your screen. You've got these long-term goals and deadlines that you hope to be able to meet. And so it's nice to talk to other folks and to have folks be interested in some of the things that I'm doing. So I really appreciate y'all, asking these questions. And I also just, before we sign off, I'll just, make a plea to listeners to, read lots of books. As I tell my students, read books, buy books, read the newspaper. We need a literate society desperately. And so I hope that if anything, it can be kind of a spark for folks to go and, kind of follow their own interest and read actual text.
Banko, you got anything else?
I do have one selfish question that's not on topic at all. But before I do that, Ben, do you have any like social medias, websites that you want to shout out as well, where people can find you or anything like that?
I do not. I am sort of painfully not online. So yeah, so no Instagram, Twitter, X, Facebook, or anything like that. So yeah, so apologize, but
So Simon and Schuster is your social media?
yeah, they are my social media. Simon and Schuster, they do a lot of the PR work for me. Great.
Got it. Okay. So the selfish question that I have that is completely not even part of this conversation, more towards the op-ed ghostwriting side of things, and now with ChatGPT, artificial intelligence in play, how do you see that changing that landscape from a writer's perspective?
Huge, huge uh question. I mean, in truth, I don't know. I don't know whether to feel threatened by it, liberated by it, invigorated by it, or what. I'm mostly I don't know. I really wish I had a good answer for you. I I will say, as someone who grades student papers, who has seen student papers that are written by AI, the ability to detect something written by AI is very clear and very evident. So, in part, I don't feel all that threatened by it, I suppose, because I think that there is like a real like distinction there. I do worry that students will, other folks, younger folks may not always make that discernment between, what is Chat GPT, produced, what is produced by authors. And so I kind of worry sometimes about the overall future of the students that I teach when more AI generated text becomes just kind of so prevalent online. And I also worry too that ChatGPT may get things wrong, right? I mean, that's what I tell my students sometimes is it's easy to look for them for answers, but it's all based on this assumption that that it's right, and sometimes it's just quite frankly not, and that history is all about the gray areas, and sometimes it's hard to actually distill that down and things that are generated by um, the internet. What I'm also really worried about is the fact that so many writers like Simon and Schuster, or publishers like Simon and Schuster, libraries, they generate all of this material, this text, this words. I'm very worried about social media companies, Meta, X, others, Google, buying these companies, doing what looks like, investment in some of these publishing houses, only for getting the access to all of that material so they can just run it through their computer systems even more. I think it raises a big question about, equity, and anyway, that's a whole different conversation. But I
Might
am,
need to bring you back.
yeah, I am worried about AI, but I'm still kind of figuring out exactly how I feel about it. But if you're one of my students, don't use it.
That
I,
answers my question.
Yeah.
yeah, I think you did unveil an awesome topic that we can get into in the future, though, of how it is impacting people in your industry, people in other industries, because yeah, this is your life's work, and if it just gets taken into a database, it kills the voice. It kills your emotional investment, your time investment,
Yeah.
and who knows, as you said, if it's even still accurate at that point.
Yeah. And I'd rather, my work and my peers and colleagues' work be read and appreciated by the public and curated and published for that purpose, rather than being bought and published and curated only to feed some AI software so that it gets its algorithms more and more precise. I'd rather it serve the purpose of other folks rather than just, letting Mark Zuckerberg feed his beast with it. Uh, yeah, but that's a whole different can of worms.
Yeah, well, Banko, thanks for setting up the teaser question for the future.
Yeah,
Exactly. That's what I do.
Yeah,
yeah,
nailed it. Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time today. This was awesome.
yeah. Thanks for having me. Thanks, guys. I really, really enjoyed it.
So, Banko, of course, thanks to you and to everyone out there. Be on the lookout for Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March, and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation by Dr. Bennett Parton. And of course, guys, thanks. So we'll sign off. Listen to Banko's outro. We'll talk to you. Bye.
Hi, everyone. Grant here. Thanks for tuning into the show. If you could like, share, and subscribe, we'd greatly appreciate it. Also, if you think you or someone you know has a good life story to tell, we are always open to guest suggestions. You can send those suggestions to our email, tworkpod@gmail.com. Thanks again for the support.